The first time Tessa Brooks and I shared a hotel room, she looked at the single king bed, sighed like the universe had personally disappointed her, and said, "One bed. Don't overthink it," which was easy for her to say. She wasn't the one who had spent 18 months pretending not to notice the way she tucked her hair behind her ear right before she was about to win an argument. My name is Owen Mason. I was 29, a senior strategy analyst at a Chicago consulting firm. And at that exact moment, I was standing in the doorway of a lake resort suite with a duffel bag in one hand, a laptop case in the other, and my work rival close enough beside me that I could catch the smell of rain and vanilla shampoo drifting off her hair. Outside, the company retreat was already unraveling. A September storm had rolled in off Lake Michigan like it had a personal score to settle. Half the leadership team was stuck somewhere on the highway. The resort's power had cut out twice already. Somewhere below us, a half-drunk account manager was trying to organize a karaoke night before dinner had even started, an idea that should have been banned by international treaty. And the front desk clerk had just delivered the news with the flat, worn-down smile of a man who'd repeated the same apology 40 times that afternoon. "I'm terribly sorry. We're completely booked." "This is honestly the last room we have." Tessa blinked once. The last room. For two employees who aren't married, dating, related, or in any way emotionally prepared for this. The clerk's smile wavered slightly. "Yes, ma'am." I should have said something useful. Something appropriately professional. Instead, because I was damp and tired and quietly thrilled by her phrasing, I said, "For the record, I feel emotionally prepared." Tessa turned her head toward me with agonizing slowness. It was the exact look she wore in conference rooms right before she tore apart a forecast model and somehow made it sound like she was doing you a favor. "You once got defensive because I bumped the font size on a slide deck. That was an act of visual sabotage. It was Calibri 11 point. It had an attitude." The clerk looked back and forth between us like he deeply regretted having ears. That was Tessa and me in a nutshell. Rivals, technically colleagues. Definitely enemies, if you asked her before her first coffee. We worked in the same division at Whitman Pierce, a firm full of people who said things like alignment, when what they actually meant was please, for the love of God. Stop arguing. Tessa and I had started the same year, climbed at nearly the same speed, and were now both circling the same open position, Director of Client Strategy. She was sharp, composed, and unnervingly good with clients. I was better with messy data, hard negotiations, and talking overconfident executives down from expensive bad ideas. Together, we were effective. Apart, we were a liability to everyone around us. Our boss, Mary Ann Voss, loved throwing us onto the same projects. "Steel sharpens steel," she liked to say. Tessa had once muttered under her breath, "So do knives." The problem was that I liked her, not in the harmless way you like a coworker who makes the day more interesting. Not in the distant way you can admire someone from across a room and then simply move on with your afternoon. I liked the way she actually listened before she cut through nonsense. I liked that she remembered the names of junior employees' spouses. I liked that she carried two pens to every meeting, and without ever looking up, slid one across the table to me the second mine inevitably died. I liked that she challenged me without ever making me feel small. And I hated all of it, because I'd learned a long time ago that wanting someone who could see straight through you was a dangerous habit to pick up. My parents had turned every family dinner into a courtroom. By 22, I'd decided peace was a better deal than passion. Dating stayed casual. Work stayed clean. Feelings stayed, locked in a drawer where they belonged. Then Tessa Brooks walked into my life in navy heels with a skeptical expression and started opening drawers without asking permissio upstairs. The suite turned out to be nicer than either of us expected, which somehow made everything worse. There was a fireplace, a balcony overlooking black water and pine trees bending in the wind, a small sofa, a single bathroom. And right in the center of the room, one enormous bed with white sheets, folded so precisely, it felt almost like an accusation. And Tessa walked in first and set her suitcase upright while I stayed near the door and said I'd head back down because maybe they had a cot somewhere. And she said they don't. And I said, you don't know that. And she said she had asked while I was busy taking a moral stand about the resort mints, and they said complimentary, and there was exactly one. And I said you counted. And she said she noticed patterns. And she slipped off her blazer, and I suddenly developed an intense professional interest in the thermostat because her blouse was pale blue and still damp at the shoulders from the storm. Nothing dramatic, nothing inappropriate. Just enough of a reminder that underneath all the spreadsheets and boardroom sparring, she was a woman, and I was a man with a pulse and a genuinely terrible strategy for ignoring that fact. And Tessa caught me looking away too fast, and a small smile tugged at her mouth. And she said, "Relax, Mason, I'm not going to pounce on you." And I said I wasn't worried. And she said I looked like a Victorian widow who had just glimpsed an ankle. And I said I was being respectful. And she said I was staring at the wall like it owed me money. And I laughed before I could stop myself, because that was the thing about her. She never let the air get too heavy unless she meant it to. She could land a joke like a jab, quick and clean, without ever drawing blood. And I dropped my duffel bag near the sofa and said I'd take it. And Tessa looked at the sofa, which was decorative in the way that suggested whoever designed it believed human spines were purely theoretical. And she said I was 6'1". And I said congratulations on the extra inch of suffering. And she said she wasn't letting me sleep on a couch shaped like a fortune cookie. And she crossed her arms and said Owen, almost never using my first name at the office, so it landed differently in that room, softer, closer than it had any right to be. And she said we were adults, and the bed was enormous, and we could build a wall of pillows down the middle and act like reasonable people. And I said reasonable people didn't usually require a border treaty. And she said reasonable people hadn't watched me take up an entire conference table. And I said that was because I had presence. And she said I had elbows. And thunder cracked outside close enough to rattle the balcony door, and the lights flickered off, and for one full second the room disappeared entirely, and then the emergency lighting kicked in from the hallway, casting Tessa in a thin grey outline, and she inhaled sharply. Not loud, not dramatic, but I heard it, and I asked if she was okay, and she said fine, the answer coming too quickly. And I didn't move toward her right away, because I knew better than to crowd someone the second you noticed a crack in their armor. And the lights blinked back on dimmer than before, and Tessa turned away and busied herself with her suitcase and said storms and old buildings, very charming. All we need now is a mysterious oil portrait, and this place could write off its own trauma. And I watched her hands, steady but not quite as steady as usual, and I said she didn't like storms. And she said she didn't like storms, elevators, or men who said let's circle back, when what they actually meant was let's never discuss this again. And I said we all carry our burdens. And she said to try to avoid all three tonight, and she glanced over her shoulder and said I was going to try to avoid being a man, and I said I'd try. And that earned me another smile that lingered half a second longer than any professional guideline would have allowed. And then my phone buzzed, and it was Marianne, and I almost let it go to voicemail because the retreat hadn't even officially kicked off yet, and I had zero interest in explaining to our boss that her two favorite gladiators had somehow been assigned the same romantic-looking battlefield. But Tessa spotted the name on the screen and said put it on speaker, and I said that felt dangerous, and she said Marianne already knew about the room, and my stomach dropped, and I said how. And Tessa lifted an eyebrow and said, because she had texted her from the lobby before I started my campaign for mint equality. And of course she had. And I answered on speaker and said, "Hi, Marianne." And Marianne asked if Tessa was there. and Tessa leaned against the desk and said, "Unfortunately." And Marianne's voice came through crisp and clearly amused, and she said, "Good." She had heard about the booking mix-up, and she trusted we could behave like adults for one night. And Tessa looked straight at me and said, "One of us can." And I pointed at myself and mouthed me. And Marianne sighed and said to save the chemistry for the clients. And the room went quiet, and Tessa's eyes moved away first, and my chest did something embarrassing. And Marianne kept going, either unaware or far too aware, and said, "Listen." Tomorrow's schedule was shifting, and Reynolds was sending their COO in person because they were getting nervous about the renewal. And I straightened because Reynolds was our biggest healthcare account. And Marianne continued and said we needed one unified pitch, not two competing versions, one strategy, one voice. And Tessa's expression sharpened, and mine probably did too. And then Marianne dropped the part that changed the temperature of the room entirely, and said she was making the decision on the director role after this retreat, and whoever proved they could lead a room without turning it into a duel would get her recommendation. And Tessa looked at me, and I looked at her, and the bed sat between us like evidence in a trial neither of us had agreed to. And Marianne said so, whatever was going on with the room situation, to figure it out, because by tomorrow afternoon she needed to know if the two of us worked better as rivals. And then she paused. Or as partners. And the call ended, and for a moment the only sound left was rain hitting the balcony glass, and Tessa set her phone down on the desk and let out a quiet laugh that didn't sound much like amusement, and repeated the word partners. And I tried for a joke and said it could be worse. And she looked at the bed again, and then back at me, and this time there was no sarcasm anywhere on her face, and she said Owen softly, and said that was exactly what she was afraid of. And I should have let it pass, because that was the mature move, the professional move, the move recommended by every HR training video, featuring stock photos of people smiling suspiciously over salad. But instead I asked why, and Tessa's mouth tightened, and she said why what? Why she was afraid of us being partners. And she turned toward the balcony, where the rain had blurred the lake into a sheet of black glass, and said, because we were excellent at competing and terrible at cooperating. And then her voice dropped quieter, and she said no, and said because she thought we might actually be good at that too. And the words slid straight under my ribs, because for 18 months I had told myself Tessa Brooks saw me as an obstacle, a useful one, occasionally an entertaining one, but still just something in her way. And I had never once let myself imagine she had wondered what it might be like to have me on her side instead. And the room felt smaller all of a sudden, and I set my phone face down on the dresser and said that didn't sound like a disaster, and she said it did if one of us stopped thinking clearly. And I laughed under my breath and said she thought partnering with me caused brain damage, and she said possibly, and there she was again, armor snapping back into place, smile sharpened at the edges. But I had seen the crack in it, and for once I didn't want to pretend I hadn't, and I said I didn't think I made her think less clearly, and she turned to face me fully and said, "Bold claim." And I said I thought I made her think faster, and her eyes narrowed, though color was rising in her cheeks, and she said, "Was that meant to be flattering?" And I said it was accurate first and flattering second, and she looked like she wanted to argue, and then she didn't. And instead she crossed to the desk and flipped open the leather folder containing the retreat itinerary, breaking the moment before either of us had to put a name to it. And she said dinner was in 40 minutes, and we needed to not look like two people trapped inside a romantic comedy. And I said it was a bit late for that because there was a fireplace, one bed, a storm and a promotion hanging over our heads, and she said a corporate romantic comedy, and I said the least sexy kind there was, and that actually got a laugh out of her. Not the polished one she used with clients, but a real one that caught her off guard and lit up her whole face before she turned away to hide it, and I was in real trouble. And we negotiated a shower schedule with all the seriousness of a trade summit, and Tessa went first, and I sat on the miserable little sofa, and pretended to review the Reynolds file while listening to the muffled rush of water and doing my absolute best not to picture anything I had no business picturing. And when she emerged 20 minutes later, I forgot every number in the account because she had changed into a black wrap dress with long sleeves, simple and elegant, the kind of thing that was supposed to read as business appropriate. But on her it read like a dare, and her damp hair fell loose around her shoulders and small gold earrings caught the light. Ones I had seen a dozen times across conference tables and never once understood as dangerous until that moment. And she caught me staring and said, "Owen," and I blinked and said yes. And she said that was not the look of a man analyzing renewal risk, and I said I was analyzing something, and she said what metric, and I said catastrophic distraction. And her expression shifted, and the joke should have saved us both, but instead it cracked the air open between us, and for a second she didn't tease back. She just looked at me like she was deciding whether to let herself believe I actually meant it, and then quietly she said, "Your turn in the shower." And I said right, and stood too fast, and nearly clipped my shoulder on the closet door, and her smile came back smoother, and she said she was known for that effect. And I said she was known for moving fast when she was cornered, and I stopped at the bathroom door and glanced back and said, "Is that what you think I do?" And her smile faded slightly, and the question hung there more serious than I had meant it to be, and Tessa lowered her eyes to the folder in her hands, and part of me wanted to ask exactly what corner. She thought I was standing in, but instead I showered and changed into a charcoal button-down and dark trousers, and gave myself a long, stern lecture in the mirror about restraint. And by the time we made it downstairs, the resort restaurant was lit almost entirely by candlelight, since half the power still hadn't come back, and the company had reserved the dining room, but the storm had thinned the crowd smaller than planned, and naturally, the only table left was tucked by the windows away from everyone else, with a clear view of rain sheeting over the lake. And Tessa looked at it, and I looked at it, and she said absolutely not, and the hostess smiled and said right this way. And we sat, and it felt absurdly like a date, which meant Tessa immediately opened the Reynolds file between us like a shield, and said their COO's main concern was cost control. And I said their main concern was trust, and cost was just the language she was using. And Tessa glanced up and said I had read the transcript twice, and I said so had she. And she said of course she had, and the candle flickered between us and her face looked softer in that light. The sharp edges warmed. And I watched her tap one finger against the margin of the page the way she always did when she was connecting ideas. And she said we should lead with the patient retention numbers. And I said, and the implementation timeline. And she nodded slowly and said then the savings model, but not my original version. And her eyes flashed, and she said, "Excuse me." And I said it was too clean, and that wasn't a strength with a client who didn't trust clean. And she said it was a strength. And I said I wasn't asking her to make her work look worse. I was asking her to show the seams, to show where the risk actually lived, because the client would trust us more if we admitted what was hard. And Tessa studied me for a beat, and then took a slow sip of water, and said that was annoyingly smart. And I said I'd take the compliment buried inside the insult, and she said it was mostly insult. And I said, but not entirely, and she admitted no, not entirely. And our server arrived, and Tessa ordered the salmon and I ordered steak, and we both ordered the same red wine purely by accident, and she looked amused and said, "Really?" And I said I could change it. And she said, "Don't." She wanted to see if I actually had taste, and I said we had worked together for 18 months, and she said professionally the jury was still out. And when the wine came, we stopped pretending to work for a while. Maybe because of the candlelight, or the storm muffling the rest of the room, or because everyone else from Whitman Pierce sat just far enough away that we could pretend for one dinner to be two. Ordinary people, instead of competitors with Mary Ann's promotion clock ticking somewhere above our heads. And Tessa told me she had grown up outside Detroit with two younger brothers who still called her before any major life decision, including buying winter coats. And I told her my older sister had 3 kids and was convinced I lived inside a glass office full of emotionally repressed men, which, to be fair, wasn't entirely inaccurate. And Tessa smiled into her wine and said, did I always deflect with jokes? And I said only when I was conscious. And she said that sounded exhausting, and I said it was efficient, and she said no. And her gaze held mine, and she said it was lonely, and the word landed too precisely, and I looked down at my glass and said she was always this direct after half a glass of wine. And she said, only with people who acted like they were one clever sentence away from disappearing. And I should have made another joke, but I didn't, and I said my parents fought a lot, and still did when they were in the same zip code, and I had gotten good at reading a room and leaving before things turned ugly. And Tessa's expression softened without a trace of pity, which mattered more than I expected it to. And she said carefully, so when I felt cornered I moved. And I thought of what she had said upstairs, and I admitted, yeah, I move, and her fingers rested near the stem of her glass inches from mine, and she said she didn't like people leaving either. And it was the first honestly unguarded thing she had offered me all night, and my voice dropped, and I asked who left. And her eyes flicked toward the rain, and she said her father. She was 15. It wasn't dramatic, no big goodbye, just slow, missed dinners, missed birthdays, missed everything until absence just became the family tradition. And she said she hated him a little, immediately. And I knew this wasn't a problem I could solve. It was a door she had opened. So instead of reaching for advice, I reached for honesty and said that must have made trust feel expensive. And she looked back at me and said yes, quietly. And neither of us moved for a moment. And then under the table her knee brushed against mine, and it could have been an accident, except she didn't pull away, and neither did I, and the contact was small. Almost ridiculous. Fabric against fabric, warmth through 2 layers of clothing. But it felt more intimate than any kiss I had had in the last year, because Tessa knew exactly what she was doing. She was staying, and I turned my hand palm up on the table between us, an invitation, not a demand. And she looked at it, and then at me, and then she slid her fingers into mine, and my heart went completely off script, and her hand was cool from the water glass, and her grip hesitant for exactly 1 second before it settled. Steady and certain, and she said this was a terrible idea, and I said probably, and she said we still wanted the same promotion, and I said I know, and she said we were sharing a room. And I said I noticed, and her thumb moved once across my knuckles, and my ability to breathe like a functioning adult male suffered accordingly. And she said Owen almost sternly, and I said yes. And she said if I ran from this, she would make my life extremely difficult, and I smiled and said Tessa. I said, she already did, and this time when she laughed, she didn't let go. And we finally let go before dessert arrived. Not because either of us wanted to, but because the head of risk management wandered past our table wearing the pleased expression of a man collecting gossip like frequent flyer miles, and Tessa withdrew her hand first smooth as a magician, and I missed it instantly. And she murmured professional distance, and I said of course, and she said our knees were still touching, and I said so they are, and she said to move mine, and I said she should move hers. And her mouth twitched, and she said this was exactly why nobody let us co-lead anything, but she didn't move. And after dinner, the retreat officially began with a welcome mixer in the lodge bar, which turned out to be corporate purgatory, dressed up with exposed beams, and everyone wore name tags despite the fact that we all already worked together, and someone had scattered team-building conversation cards across every table. And Tessa picked one up and read it aloud and said, describe your leadership style in 1 word. And I said, hungry. And she said that was not a leadership style, and I said it was at buffets. And she flipped to the next card and said what animal best represents your work ethic. And I said she should go first and guessed wolf. And she studied me and said accurate and asked mine. And I said golden retriever, and Tessa nearly choked on her water and said absolutely not. And I said loyal, strategic, good hair. And she said I was not a golden retriever. And said you're a fox in a quarter zip, and I'm choosing to hear charming and woodland creature. And for one genuinely dangerous second, the entire bar fell away around us. And then Marianne materialized at Tessa's shoulder, like a woman who had learned to move through rooms without announcing herself, and studied us both with the particular focus of someone who could see through bone, and said simply good. You're talking. And Tessa straightened immediately, the professional composure snapping back into place like a shade being pulled. And Marianne set two folders on the bar between us without ceremony, her voice shifting into the register. She reserved for things that actually mattered, and said Reynolds moved the morning meeting to 9, and the COO wanted a concise recommendation. 20 minutes, no meandering, no grandstanding, no performing for each other. A real answer to a real problem. And I took one of the folders and said we could do that. And Marianne's gaze moved between us with the slow deliberateness of someone running a calibration, and she said, "Can you?" And Tessa answered before I had assembled a single word, not a qualified yes, not a competitive correction, not the careful diplomatic language we usually deployed to avoid conceding anything to each other. Just yes, clean and certain, and entirely without armor. And it hit me harder than it had any right to. And Marianne nodded once in the way she nodded when she had decided to believe something provisionally, and said then, "Prove it." And when she left, Tessa opened her folder and began scanning the updated notes, and I opened mine, and the old instinct rose. The one that said retreat to opposite corners and build the stronger case and arrive at the table with more ammunition. But it didn't take hold because Tessa shifted closer so we could read the same page, her shoulder brushing my arm in a way she didn't acknowledge, and neither did I. And she said quietly, "Your trust angle works better now." And I said, "Our trust angle." And she looked up, and I kept my eyes on the page, because looking at her directly had become something I needed to ration carefully. And I said, if we were partners, it was ours. And she was quiet for a moment that lasted slightly longer than a professional moment should. And then her voice came out softer than her usual register, careful, like she was setting something fragile on a shelf. And she said, "Careful, Mason," that almost sounded generous. And I said, "Don't tell anyone. I had a brand to protect." And we worked in the bar until the playlist devolved into something that should have been sealed in a vault sometime around 2009. And the other remaining guests started singing along without apology. And by 10:30, we had a pitch outline that was genuinely better than either of us would have built alone. Tessa's clean, precise, numbers carrying the skeleton, and my messier human truth, giving it weight and motion. And by 11, the storm had worsened to the point where the windows were rattling hard enough that the bartender announced last call 20 minutes early with the apologetic expression of a man caught between hospitality and structural concern. And by 11:15, we were back upstairs, the door closed behind us alone with the fireplace, and the rain hammering the glass, and the king bed we had both been successfully pretending was not the dominant piece of furniture in the room. And Tessa set the folder on the desk and turned to face the bed and said, "Pillow wall. Architectural integrity is non-negotiable." And we moved to opposite sides of the mattress and began constructing what would become objectively the most formal barrier in resort history. 4 pillows arranged down the center with the seriousness of a surveyor laying boundary markers, and a rolled blanket placed at the foot with ceremonial precision. And Tessa stepped back and assessed our work with the expression she wore when reviewing a model she found satisfactory, and said, "There, a tasteful demilitarized zone." And I said, "It'll never hold." And she said, "Then control your elbows." And I said I thought she liked my elbows. And she said she had never once said that. And I said she had mentioned them. And she said in court that was called evidence of distress. And she bent to turn back the covers, and I made the conscious choice to look at the far wall because the line of her neck in the lamplight was apparently sufficient to dismantle my entire moral infrastructure. And then she said my name, Owen, and I looked back, and she was watching me from across the bed with an expression I couldn't parse at distance, something between careful and open. And she said I kept doing that, and I said doing what, and she said deciding not to look, and heat moved up the back of my neck, and I said I was trying to be respectful, and she said I know, and hugged a pillow against her chest, and something shifted in the line of her shoulders that had nothing to do with confidence and everything to do with vulnerability. And she said, but sometimes it felt like I was trying not to want her, and the sentence took everything out of the room, the rain, the fire, the breath I had been holding without knowing it. All of it went quiet around the thing she had placed between us, this honest and undefended and entirely unstrategic observation. And I could have lied because I had been lying in small, careful ways for months, through sarcasm and distance, and timed exits from conference rooms when she leaned too close. But something about that room, that night, that woman standing across a bed in lamplight, with her arms wrapped around a pillow like it was keeping her steady, made the lie completely unavailable to me. And I said I am, and her fingers tightened against the pillow fabric. And I stepped around the corner of the bed slowly enough that she could have stopped me at any point, and she didn't stop me, and I kept moving until I was close, and I said it again. I'm trying not to want you. And then I said why, all of it, the whole honest catalogue, because I respected her, because we worked together. Because tomorrow mattered in ways we couldn't afford to forget. Because if I let myself start, I didn't know how to keep it contained. I didn't know how to make it small. And I had never been good at small when it came to things that mattered. And Tessa's eyes moved over my face like she was verifying each word against something internal. And then she said, and I don't want small. And my heart made a hard and entirely helpless movement toward her. And she dropped the pillow, and it landed on the carpet without a sound. And she said, I also don't want reckless. And her voice was steady, but her expression wasn't. And I said I can do not reckless. And she said I had once sent a 12-slide rebuttal at midnight with the subject line respectfully no. And I said that was passion for accuracy. And she said that was warfare conducted in Helvetica. And I smiled in spite of the way my pulse was conducting its own separate emergency. And I said I was capable of restraint. And she said, prove it. And I took one more step, and we were close now. Close enough that I could see the faint scatter of freckles across the bridge of her nose, and the mascara that had softened slightly at the outer corners of her lashes, and the small tremor at the edge of her jaw that she would have denied under oath in any professional setting on earth. And I lifted my hand slowly and deliberately, and stopped just beside her cheek, and I said, can I? And she nodded. And I touched her face the way you touch something you have been trusted with rather than something you have managed to acquire. And her eyes closed for half a second, just half. And that half second took something from me I was never going to recover, and I leaned in and kissed her forehead, soft, deliberate, nowhere near sufficient. And when I pulled back, her eyes were open and dark, and carrying an expression I had never seen on her before, unguarded in a way she almost never permitted. And she said, voice not entirely even, that was your proof of restraint. And I said yes. And then I said I hated it. And she said, no, you didn't. And I said no, quietly, I really didn't. And then she caught the front of my shirt in both hands and rose onto her toes. And our first real kiss was not professional, and it did not align with company values or quarterly objectives or any of the 17 reasonable arguments I had been making to myself for the better part of 14 months. It was Tessa making a decision, her mouth meeting mine with the same fierce, precise intelligence she brought to every argument she had ever won, only warmer, only unguarded, only alive with every single thing we had been refusing to say out loud in fluorescent-lit conference rooms and airport terminals, and the particular loaded silence of shared car rides to client sites. And I slid one hand to her waist and kept the other careful at her jaw and kissed her back like I had been quietly starving for longer than I had any dignified way to admit. and she made a small sound against my mouth, and that was when I stopped. Not because I wanted to, because wanting had become a room with no ceiling and no walls and no visible exits, but because some remaining functional part of my judgment understood that this mattered too much to handle carelessly, and I rested my forehead against hers and said her name, and she said, "I know." And her breathing was uneven in a way she would never have permitted in any other context. And she said work, promotion, one room, one bed, many problems. And I said not problems. And her laugh came out shaky, and she said complications then, and I said yes. And she loosened her grip on my shirt but didn't step away, and she asked, "Do you regret that?" And I said no before the question had fully finished, and her eyes softened at the speed of it, and I brushed my thumb once along her waist and asked the same of her, and she said no. And then quieter, almost to the room rather than to me, she said, "But I'm scared." And that was the part they never included in the version of this story that got told at dinner parties. The softness after the spark, the particular terror of being genuinely seen by someone and wanting, despite all evidence, that this was dangerous to stay visible. And I said, "Me too." And she looked at me like that admission had relieved her of something heavy, and the ache in my chest at the sight of it was specific and complete. And we changed for bed in turns with an exaggerated mutual politeness that would have been funny if my nervous system hadn't still been holding detailed sensory information about the exact shape of her against me. And when the lights were out, and we were both lying in the faint amber glow from the fireplace, the pillow wall looked precisely as structurally credible as it had always been, which was to say not at all. And Tessa lay on her side, facing me, and I lay on mine, facing her, and the rain had softened to a steady tap against the glass. And she said, "This is a terrible pillow wall." And I said, "Structurally, yes." And she said she could see me, and I said that was generally how walls failed. And she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Owen." And I said, "Yeah." And she said, "Tomorrow." If Marianne only recommended one of us, and the old fear surfaced immediately, competition, resentment, the particular cold logic of a situation designed to produce a winner and a loser. And I watched it rise, and then I reached over the pillow border and held my hand out in the dark, open, an offer without conditions. And Tessa looked at it for a moment that lasted long enough to matter, and then she took it, her fingers wrapping around mine with a certainty that felt like something decided rather than something tested. And I said, "We don't make tonight's truth conditional on tomorrow's outcome." And her fingers tightened, and she said, "That sounds suspiciously healthy." And I said I was trying something new, and she said, "Don't strain yourself." And I said, "Good night, Brooks." And her thumb moved slowly across my knuckles, the same small, unhurried motion from dinner, and she said, "Good night, Mason." And I fell asleep, holding the hand of the woman I had spent 14 months competing with and losing sleep over, and arguing within my head at 2 in the morning, and carefully not wanting in every way I knew how. And for the first time in longer than I could honestly account, for I didn't feel the familiar pull toward the exit. And I woke up to Tessa's foot hooked around my ankle, which told me everything I needed to know about how the night had gone structurally. And the pillow wall had collapsed with the quiet inevitability of all things built on productive self-deception. One pillow on the floor, one wedged against my back like it had been fleeing the scene. The rolled blanket relocated to somewhere, near the headboard, having apparently decided its presence was no longer required. And Tessa lay close enough that her hair brushed my chin, her hand, still loosely threaded through mine, beneath the covers, her breathing the slow and undefended rhythm of someone who had no idea she was being memorized. And I didn't move, and I told myself it was consideration, not wanting, and that was at best partially accurate. And I wanted to hold the image of her like this, no sharp reply loaded and waiting. No careful professional distance maintained out of habit. No armor adjusted to the angle of the room. Just warmth and the small crease between her brows, smoothed entirely away by sleep. and the loose curl of her fingers around mine like she had found something worth keeping and hadn't let go even. Unconsciously. And then her eyes opened, and she blinked once and looked at our joined hands and looked at her foot hooked around my ankle and looked at me. And she said, "Your elbow breached the treaty." Voice still soft with sleep. And I said my elbow, and said her foot had annexed my entire ankle, and she said that was strategic defense, and I said she was extremely aggressive in her sleep. And she said she was extremely effective in her sleep. And I smiled before I had the presence of mind to decide whether to, and her gaze dropped to my mouth, and the quality of the morning changed in a way that had nothing to do with the pale grey light coming through the curtains. Because last night could be attributed, if you were determined to attribute it to stormlight and wine, and the accumulated pressure of too many honest sentences spoken in low light. But this was morning, clear and quiet and fully witnessed, and Tessa was still looking at me with the expression of someone choosing carefully and badly at the same time. And I lifted our joined hands and pressed my lips to her knuckles, and her expression shifted, the teasing edge going soft and slightly undone. And she said, "Owen," and I said, "I know." 9 o'clock meeting, and she said that wasn't what she was going to say, and my heart did something abrupt and ungraceful, and I asked what she was going to say. And she took a breath and held it for a moment with the look of someone deciding whether to spend something they had been saving. And then she said, "I liked waking up with you." And there were a dozen responses available to me, the deflecting ones, the safe ones, the ones that would have kept everything at a careful and professional altitude. And I used none of them, and I leaned across the collapsed remains of our border and kissed her. And it was quieter than the night before, but somehow more consequential, because morning kisses had a different weight. They didn't belong to storms or to the particular permission of late-night honesty. They belonged to people who had woken up and seen clearly and chosen to continue. And Tessa's hand moved to my jaw, and she kissed me back with a slow exhale that traveled directly through my sternum and set up residence somewhere important. And then her alarm detonated from the nightstand, and we separated with the guilty speed of people who had been caught doing something they intended to keep doing, and Tessa seized her phone and silenced it with feeling and said, "Reality is rude." And I said, "Reality has genuinely poor timing." And she sat up, hair disordered, one strap of her sleep shirt fallen off her shoulder, and leveled a finger at me with the authority of someone chairing a meeting, and said, "No looking." And I said I was looking at the ceiling, and she said I was looking at the ceiling with documented intent, and I said I contained multitudes. And she threw a pillow at my face, which I accepted as fair. And by 8:30, we were downstairs in the small conference room, dressed with the immaculate composure of two people who had absolutely not spent the morning kissing each other in the wreckage of a failed pillow wall. Tessa in a cream blouse and tailored trousers, and me in a navy suit, and the facial expression of a man who was managing his situation with extraordinary discipline. And the only visible evidence of anything was that when she handed me a pen before the clients arrived, her fingers stayed a half-second longer than the exchange required, and I felt it in my shoulder. Blades, but I kept my face entirely neutral, and I thought we were doing very well. And Andrea Hall, Reynolds' COO, arrived at 9 sharp with 2 directors and the energy of a woman who had sat through enough consultant presentations to have developed a personal policy against being charmed. And Marianne took her seat at the end of the table with the stillness of someone who had already decided what she was watching for, and under other circumstances, most circumstances, every circumstance before this one, that combination would have activated the worst version of our professional dynamic. The one where I pushed harder and Tessa polished more, and we turned competence into a contact sport with real business consequences. And instead, when I finished laying out the renewal risk framed around the trust problem, Tessa picked up the thread without a seam and said, which is exactly why we're not recommending a clean rollout. Narrative. advancing to her savings model with the calm of someone who had already won the argument she was making. And she said we were recommending full transparency with their regional teams about where the friction points were and giving them meaningful control over their own implementation milestones before the platform went live. And Andrea's focus sharpened in the specific way it sharpens when someone says something unexpected and accurate. And she said, "You're admitting your own platform will create friction." And Tessa said, "Yes." And I said, because any vendor who tells you the transition will be seamless is selling you a story. And stories get very expensive around the third quarter when reality introduces itself. And Andrea looked between us with the expression of someone recalibrating a prior assumption. And for the next 20 minutes, Tessa and I moved through the presentation with a fluency that should not have been possible given that we had built the whole thing in a bar the night before while someone 2 tables over was performing an emotional karaoke rendition of a song from 2007. And she made the numbers feel like people, and I made the human stakes feel quantifiable. And when Andrea challenged a timeline projection, Tessa didn't defend it reflexively, but glanced at me. Not for rescue, not for permission, but for the particular kind of confirmation that passes between people who have decided to trust each other's judgment. And I answered the challenge, and then handed the floor back to her, and she carried it the rest of the way home. And when Andrea closed her folder at the end and said this was the first recommendation she had received from our firm that sounded like we actually understood what they were afraid of. Marianne's expression revealed nothing whatsoever, and Tessa's foot found mine under the table, and I knew with complete certainty that it wasn't accidental. And after the clients cleared the room, Marianne remained her notebook, open, one finger tapping against the cover with the measured rhythm of someone organizing a conclusion. And she said that was the presentation she had been waiting 18 months to see from the two of us. And Tessa's shoulders dropped by a fraction that only someone paying close attention would have caught, and I exhaled slowly through my nose. And Marianne's gaze moved from me to Tessa and back, and she said we were both significantly stronger when we stopped trying to beat each other, and Tessa gave a small, careful nod and said we know. And that we landed in the room with a warmth that I felt across the table, and Marianne's eyes narrowed slightly, not unkindly, more the expression of someone filing new data, and she said, "Good. I'll have my promotion recommendation by this afternoon." And the warmth cooled in the precise and predictable way it always cooled when that word entered the conversation. And when Marianne left, Tessa began gathering her papers with movements that were brisk and precise and entirely closed. And I said her name, and she said, "I'm fine." And I said, "I know that tone," and she said, "What tone?" And I said the one that meant she was rearranging everything into categories, so nothing could reach the parts that actually mattered. And she snapped the folder shut and said, "The promotion matters." And I said, "I know it does." And she said, and if I got it, she needed to be able to feel good about me getting it without feeling like an idiot for everything that had happened last night and this morning. And I moved closer and said, "Why would wanting me make her an idiot?" And she was quiet for a moment that had edges and said, "Because wanting people had historically not been her most efficient strategy." And the words were dressed in professional language, but the wound underneath them wasn't professional at all. And I softened everything in my voice and said, "I'm not your father." And her eyes came up fast, and she said, "I know that." And I said, "And you're not my parents' marriage." And that stopped her completely. And I swallowed and said, "But if we kept bringing old damage into new rooms and dressing it in new clothes and calling it caution, we were going to destroy this before it became anything worth protecting." And she stared at me with an expression that was moving between fear and fury, and something underneath both of those that was tender enough to be painful to look at directly. And she said this, as though testing the weight of the word, and I didn't retreat from it, and said, "You and me." And her breath caught, and the hallway beyond the conference room door hummed with the ordinary noise of the retreat winding down. Voices, rolling carts, the distant sound of laughter from some organized activity that sounded like it involved trust and falling, and none of it touched the small, precise space between us. And I said, I want this. Not because of the storm last night, not because we were sharing a room, not because the competition got confusing and proximity did something to my judgment. I want you. I want to find out who we actually are with each other when we're not performing rivals for an audience that has stopped watching. And her eyes went bright in a way. She tried to blink back into place the effort of it, visible and completely unsuccessful. And she asked if I got the promotion. And I said then I would be genuinely proud of her and probably a little jealous. And she said probably. And I said I'm evolved, I'm not a saint. And a laugh came out of her, shaky and reluctant and entirely real. And she asked, and if I got it. And I said then I'd expect her to be ruthlessly honest with me about every mistake I made in the first 6 months. And she almost smiled and said she could do that. And I said, I know. It's one of your love languages. And the word arrived in the room slightly ahead of my intention. And we both heard it land, and neither of us moved for a moment that stretched like the pause before weather. And I opened my mouth with the vague plan of softening it, redirecting it, giving it a graceful exit, and then Tessa stepped forward and took my lapels in both hands and kissed me, not carefully. Not the way last night had been careful and testing, and asking quiet questions, but as a choice made in full daylight with the door unlocked, and the folders still on the table, and the entirely real and complicated world just on the other side of the glass. And it was unambiguous and decided, and it went through me like a current finding its ground, and I wrapped my arms around her waist and pulled her in, and she made that sound again, the small one, the one that had undone me completely the first time, and showed no signs of being less effective on repetition. And when she broke the kiss, her forehead rested against my chin, and she said very quietly, you are not allowed to run. And I said, I'm not running. And she said, I mean it. And I said, so do I. And she tipped her head back and looked at me and said, we're going to be complicated. And I said, definitely. And she said, people will talk. And I said, people are already talking. And she said, risk management, saw our knees touching under the table last night. And her lips curved into something that could only be described as scandalous. And I said, I have very expressive knees. And she laughed, quiet and real, and pressed close against my chest. And for a few minutes, we stayed exactly like that, laughing softly into each other's space, like we had stolen something genuinely precious from a day that had been specifically designed to measure and sort and separate us. And then her phone buzzed on the table, and she glanced at the screen, and her expression did something complicated and brief. And she turned the phone toward me without comment, and it was a message from Marianne. 4 words, my office, both of you, and we looked at each other, and she said together, and I said together, and we walked out of the conference room side by side into whatever came next. Not rivals running parallel lines toward the same fixed point, but two people who had finally, after 14 months of careful and exhausting avoidance, decided to stop pretending that the most interesting direction was anywhere other than toward each other. Her smile faded. It's Marianne, she said. She wants us in the lodge office at 4. I looked at the screen, then back at her. The decision. Tessa slipped her hand into mine, firm and warm. Partners. I asked, her grip tightened. Partners, she said, and this time neither of us let go. At 4:00, Tessa and I walked into Marianne's temporary office, still holding hands. We let go before entering, but not fast enough. Marianne looked up from behind the desk, saw the space between us, saw our faces, and sighed. Oh, for heaven's sake, she said. Finally, Tessa froze. Excuse me. Marianne removed her reading glasses. Do you think I've spent 18 months watching you two weaponize sexual tension in budget meetings and learn nothing? I coughed. Tessa turned scarlet. It was possibly the greatest moment of my professional life. Marianne held up a hand. I don't need details. I don't want details. I want adults who can disclose appropriately to HR if this becomes serious, and not make it my problem if it doesn't. It's serious, I said. Tessa looked at me. I hadn't planned to say it that quickly, that plainly in front of our boss, but once the words were out, I didn't regret them. Tessa's face softened in a way that made the whole room feel less like judgment and more like weather clearing. Yes, she said. It is. Marianne studied us for a moment, then nodded as if that answered more than she had asked. Good. Then I'll be direct. I'm recommending Tessa for Director of Client Strategy. The words hit. For half a second, the old part of me reacted first, the competitive part, the careful little machine that measured wins and losses before emotion had a chance to complicate them. Then I looked at Tessa. She stood very still, like happiness was something fragile she didn't trust herself to hold. And I knew I didn't have to perform pride. I felt it. I smiled. You earned it. Her eyes flicked to mine, wary and hopeful at once. Owen, you did, I said, and Reynolds proved it. Marianne leaned back. I'm also recommending Owen for a new role. My head turned. What? Senior lead, strategic accounts, same level, different track, more client authority, less internal management. Frankly, it's where your instincts belong. I stared at her. Tessa's hand found mine beside the chair, hidden from Marianne's desk, but not from Marianne's eyes. Our boss pretended not to notice. You both get a step forward, Marianne said, not the same step. That seems to be a lesson the two of you needed. Tessa laughed once, breathless. I squeezed her fingers. For so long, I had thought one of us had to lose for the other to win. That was the shape rivalry gave the world. Narrow, brutal, simple, but Tessa had never been my opposite. She was my match. After the meeting, we walked out into the lodge hallway, where retreat chaos continued, as if our lives had not just quietly rearranged themselves. Someone was trying to herd consultants into a mindfulness circle. Someone else was arguing with the coffee machine. Tessa pulled me into a small alcove near a window. You meant it? She asked. That it's serious. Her voice went soft. Yes, I stepped closer. I meant it when I said I wanted you. I meant it when I said I wasn't running. And I meant it when I said you earned that promotion. She searched my face, maybe looking for resentment, maybe looking for the exit sign. And I used to keep lit behind my eyes. She didn't find it, so she rose onto her toes and kissed me. It was brief because we were at a company retreat, and Marion had just warned us not to become an HR webinar. But it was sure happy, a promise pressed into the corner of my mouth. When she pulled back, she smiled. Congratulations, senior lead. Congratulations, director. You're going to be impossible about this. Me? Never. You already look smug. I'm dating the new director. That feels worth a little smugness. Her cheeks warmed. Dating, I stilled. Unless you prefer engaged in a complex strategic alliance. I prefer dinner, she said. With me. With you, tonight. Tonight. I glanced toward the storm-cleared windows where late sunlight was breaking over the lake. That sounds dangerously like a date. Tessa slipped her hand into mine. Don't overthink it. 6 months later, I moved into a new apartment with better light, and Tessa claimed the left side of my couch before I had finished assembling the coffee table. We took things carefully at work. We disclosed to HR. We avoided public displays beyond the occasional devastating shared glance over bad quarterly forecasts. Tessa became the kind of director people wanted to impress because she made excellence feel possible. I built the strategic accounts role into something that let me do what I loved without pretending I wanted her job. And outside the office, we learned each other for real. She learned that I sang badly when cooking and worse, when assembling furniture. I learned that she cried at old dog commercials and dennied it with terrifying conviction. She liked sleeping with one cold foot tucked under my leg. I liked waking up before her and making coffee strong enough to count as a legal stimulant. We still argued. Of course we argued. We argued about slide titles, thermostat settings, whether brunch was a meal or a social trap, and whether my grey sweater was classic or emotionally dependent on 2018. But we stopped arguing to win. Mostly. A year after that night at the resort, Whitman Pierce held the next annual retreat in a downtown hotel with extremely competent booking software. Tessa and I checked in together. The front desk clerk smiled. One king room, correct. Tessa looked at me, eyes bright with the memory. I leaned against the counter. Only if she promises not to annex my ankle. She makes no promises, Tessa said. In the elevator, she stood beside me in a red dress, her hand tucked into mine, her thumb moving over my knuckles the way it had under the dinner table during the storm. You know, she said, I was terrified that first night of sharing a room with me, of wanting to. The elevator doors opened onto our floor. I turned to her before we stepped out. I was terrified you'd see through me. She smiled. I did. And she reached up, straightened my collar, and kissed me softly, and I stayed. Later in our room, there was one bed, no pillow wall, and rain tapping gently against the window like an old story, returning with a kinder ending. Tessa stood by the glass, city lights shining around her, and held out her hand. I took it, not as a rival, not as a man preparing to leave before the fight began. As someone chosen, as someone who chose her back. What would you have done if your company retreat over booked you into one room with your biggest work rival, and there was only one bed? Have you ever experienced something even remotely similar? Tell me your story in the comments. If you like this one, leave a like, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video.